Kate Falcha, welcome to Psychics and Psychos. I am presenting the story of the people we're going to look at today, and Denise will be joining me in our second video to do the in-depth analysis of the people involved. I'm going to give you the background. And this is a controversial one. I'm doing the story of Elizabeth Short, a young woman who was murdered actually in the 40s, but over time she has become known as the Black Dahlia. And it has some connection to the time period when she died. Film noir was popular. There was a movie called The Blue Dahlia. Somehow or other, she got associated with that nickname. I find it very anonymizing, dehumanizing. I think the real person gets lost in this fantasy of who she was and what happened. There is so much out there. Over the years, I've read a variety of things. My opinion has been swayed by the media I've consumed. I think we can all relate to that. And now I have sort of taken a swing one way, gone back a whole other way, and now I'm kind of in the middle. I owe that to a remarkable person named Larry Harnish, who has made it his project in life, his purpose in life, actually, to set the record straight as well as he can about Elizabeth Short and her unfortunate death. He's been doing it for a number of decades now. He does have a YouTube channel and website. I will try to remember to put the links down below, but it's Larry Harnish, Harnisch. I got in touch with him. He doesn't do really media interviews anymore. He's disgusted by true crime as a popular consumption. I totally hear what he's talking about. However, I think Denise and I come at this from a different approach. And I want to be really careful here to emphasize that we're going to be looking at Elizabeth Short, the person, and not Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. It's unavoidable to talk about the crime. We're going to talk about some of the theories and suspects. Pretty much all of them have been debunked. And recently I heard Larry on a fabulous podcast called The Consult, which is a number of retired FBI profilers go over cases, and they don't pretend to solve them. What they do is provide an analysis of the behavior as well as they can with the facts at hand that they have. And he joined them, and they talked about the Black Dahlia, the case, the whole thing. And he told them his well-informed impression of who Elizabeth Short was. They agreed with him. And it wasn't something that I had thought of. Maybe, I'm very easily persuaded, but to me it had a ring of truth. So let's talk about who Elizabeth Short was before she became this form of entertainment for people. I hate to say that, but really and truly, that is what it is. So Elizabeth Short, she was born July 29th, 1924, so long ago, in Hyde Park, Boston, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters. Her father was a sailor. He left the Navy and began building miniature golf courses. But he lost everything in 1929, as did many people, and didn't handle it well. In 1930, his car was found abandoned on the Charlestown Bridge over the river, and everybody thought, oh, he jumped. So that was the assumption, that his wife was now a widow and his children were without their father. Her mother became a bookkeeper to support these 5 girls, but they didn't have a lot. They were struggling and relatively poor. They weren't, they all shared a room and they didn't have a lot of new clothes. And it was a struggle. It was, the Depression. Elizabeth had asthma and lung problems. Asthma, in that time period was so misunderstood. It was really awful. At the age of 15 in 1939, she had lung surgery, and they recommended, the doctors did, that she go somewhere warm and dry, or at least warm. And she went to Florida because they had family friends who lived there. So she went there for the climate, and she dropped out of high school. She's 15. And then a couple of years later, in 1942, so after having been presumed dead for 12 years, her mother got an apology letter from her father. He was alive in California. So at the age of 18, Elizabeth thought, well, things were stagnating financially for the whole family. So she decided to move to California, move to Vallejo, and live with her father in December of 1942. They got into a lot of arguments, and it's interesting. I read a variety of different sources, and so in the margin I wrote, what did he do? But I read later that he actually invited her to live with him more or less as a live-in housekeeper. He wanted her to be doing, well, that's how she saw it. He wanted her to be doing chores. She didn't feel like that's why she was there. So they had a big falling out. She moved out. She moved out after 1 month, January of 1943. So she got a job at the Base Exchange. This is like the store for the military on the military base at Vandenberg Air Force Base in Lompoc, California. So after a brief stay, she left because she had a Air Force sergeant boyfriend who mistreated her. And some of these stories, take everything with a block of salt. The information that's out there is often repeated so often that people think it's fact. And I have, no way of researching deep dives. That's why I try to look at a lot of different sources. I'm so grateful to Larry Harnish because he is a professional researcher, fact finder. And so I actually trust the work that he's done. Now, I don't know about this Air Force sergeant, so block of salt. In mid-1943, she moved to Santa Barbara. Anyone who's not familiar, I was raised in Santa Barbara. And so, my antennae went up because how weird, how synchronistic. Anyway, she moved to Santa Barbara, and I no understanding of what it is exactly she did, but we know one thing she did. In September 23rd of 1943, she got arrested for underage drinking, and the juvenile cop sent her back to Massachusetts. So I'm assuming, because she was 18, I'm assuming anybody under 21. So they sent her back to Massachusetts. Well, I don't know if they put her on a bus or a train, but she changed course and she went to Florida. She only occasionally visited her mother in Boston. She claimed she was engaged to a pilot, a military pilot. And that on August 10th of 1945, the very last day of World War II, he died in a crash. Now, Larry Harnish, it's his opinion that this was a trauma that really pushed her over the edge. So just file that there for reference. In July of 1946, she went to Los Angeles to visit a guy who was a friend from Florida who lived in Long Beach at the Naval Reserve Air Base. She rented a room behind a nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard, and she worked as a waitress. Now, you will hear almost everywhere that you research her that she was a wannabe actress, kind of a failed actress who auditioned and never really got a job. And apparently for a while in Chicago, she modeled hats. So she did do some modeling. I don't know if she did modeling in Los Angeles. She never acted in anything. And to anyone's definite knowledge, she never actually even auditioned, but she told people she was an actress. And she very much is the creator of her own story. So keep that in mind. On January 9th of 1947, she returned to Los Angeles after a trip to San Diego with Robert Red Manley. His name will come up again. He was a married salesman. He took her to the bus station, I believe. Bus station, train station, but he took her to the station, to the lockers so she could lock up her possessions. So just a small aside. She was homeless and unemployed. She was nomadic, peripatetic, sort of parasitic. She was couch surfing, getting people to buy her food, borrowing money from people. We'll talk about this later, but as I recall, Larry Harnish said she went on hundreds of first dates. There's more to this we'll talk about, but just to note that she was putting her things in the bus station locker. She had no place to go. She asked to be dropped off at the Biltmore Hotel. She said to Red Manley that she was going to be meeting her sister there for a visit. She was seen using the phone in the lobby. She was seen at a lounge 3/8 of a mile away from the Biltmore Hotel a little bit later on that day. So now I want to be circumspect about the actual condition that she was next seen, in which she was next seen. She met with foul play, and it was horrific. I have to be cagey about the words I use, and a lot of the descriptions of what happened to her are presented kind of slanted in such a way as to support theories. And keep in mind, these are all theories. Nobody has been adjudicated guilty for this crime. So January 15th of 1947, a naked body, bisected horizontally, was found in the Lyman Park area of Los Angeles. This was a new and not very developed neighborhood. The large expanses of land that had been part of the whole Spanish land holdings were eventually, and we won't even talk, you want to know more about that, then you should watch my Saturday book, an indigenous people's history of the United States. And you'll learn all about the land grants in California. And so this land eventually whittled down from that to ranches and farms, and then further down to residential neighborhoods as they were more developed. So that's what was happening in this area. It wasn't very developed, but the development that existed was relatively new houses, pretty much bought up by young couples with small children, young couples who were returning from the aftermath of World War II. This body had been dead, they assumed, about 10 hours. They knew that it had been washed and scrubbed. Some say it was posed. Her face was slashed at the corners of her mouth. There's a term for that. It's called the Glasgow smile. Glasgow's, the city in Scotland. And that had to do with kind of gang behavior, to shut people up or to punish people for talking, or to create a situation where they're terrorized and marked. There were heel and tire track impressions. They found a cement sack. She had ligature marks on her hands and arms and, wrists and feet, and lacerations. Her death was caused by shock, blood loss. Her mother was called and told by reporters. First, they told her that Elizabeth had won a contest, and she was all excited for her daughter. And then they drop the real truth of why they were calling on this poor woman. I mean, journalistic ethics. This became immediately a sensation. The local paper sensationalized it. They gave her the nickname. They paid her mother to come in and talk to the cops. Media gave her the money to come from Boston to talk to the cops. They created a persona for her in the media of an adventuress. And this is an unfair label that was put on her, because that was not at all what she was. She was attempting to be a survivor. A call came into the police, to the evidence room, that in 3 days you're going to get an envelope. You're going to get evidence. And in 3 days they got an envelope with papers, her birth certificate, her address book, and then there was a pile of men's clothes with an apology letter for her death found on the Venice beach by the water, implying, another case of self-harm. I thought that's interesting that in her biography, we can point to 2 manufactured situations like that. The police thought, well, was that really the one who did it or not? They interviewed more than 150 men, including all of the students at the UCLA Medical School, because they felt a doctor had done it. They had 750 investigators by the time they were done. They had a $10,000 reward, which that's a lot of money in those days. And they got notes sent to them, to the police. Nobody knows whether any or one, what there was legitimate evidence there. It was a media circus. There were all kinds of allegations made about her. I have to be kind of circumspect about the words I use. That she had a dependency on adult behavior or on substances, that she was inclined to engage in certain behaviors having to do with a lack of clothing or adult behavior for money. For those of you who don't know, I don't know why, but I can say things here that other people say I get dinged for it. If I sound a little paranoid, it's because I am. And I'm just trying to have an overabundance of caution about my vocabulary. It's a nice creative challenge. They got 500 confessions, and some of these people who confessed hadn't even been born when she died. The most famous suspect, as far as just popular knowledge today, is George Hodel, and we will talk about him more at length later. His son was an LA Police Department homicide detective. Hodel was a doctor. He worked in Hollywood. He did abortions. He took care of STIs, VD in those days, for rich guys' girlfriends, politicians, cops, famous rich people in Hollywood. There were allegations that he was responsible for the death of his secretary to eliminate witnesses of the other crimes that he had committed. There's a whole narrative. So keep in mind that George Hodel's son, Steve, I think his name is Steve Hodel. I read the book. He wrote a book about it. And Larry Harnish has quite a bit to say about it that's very interesting. And I should say now, and I'll reiterate this later, I am not espousing any theory. I only know what I have read and seen. I don't know with 100% accuracy what's exactly correct and what is not correct. I will tell you at the end what Larry Harnish believes is truth and what's fiction. I think if anybody can be relied upon, he's probably the best resource. The behavioral analysts from the FBI retired agreed with him in bulk. So the burning question was who did it. Some say that and this has been debated for decades and decades and decades. So in the course of that time, some say it was related to the torso murders that happened in Cleveland between 1934 and 1938, the lipstick murders in Chicago in 1946. Just hotly debated and never a satisfactory conclusion. So I tried to watch as much as I could. There's just an overabundance and embarrassment of riches when it comes to the story because it's treated, it's entertainment. There are all kinds of theories about it being related through George Hodel to a famous photographer, Man Ray. The cuts here are said to be a reproduction of one of his photographs. But when you start to parse the wheat from the chaff, you find out that a lot of this stuff has just blown up over the decades. So one of the stories that I stumbled on was a new book that just came out called Sisters in Death by a guy from Hollywood called Eli Frankel. Now, I listened to the story of his book and I took down notes. I did not know what to think. And at that point, I knew about the Hodel story. I now knew about Frankel's theory. And I was really in a quandary about how much to present here and what to say about it. That's when I tried to get in touch with Mr. Harnish. And I'm very sad that he no longer puts himself out there on kind of entertainment podcasts because to him this is not entertainment. And I respect that, but I really respect the work he's done. He has done unbelievable volumes of really serious work. He's researched things for months and months and months, one little thing. And he's amassed a body of work that is just impressive. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go to the source. I'm going to ask him what he thinks of Hodel and what he thinks of Frankel. And he sent me links to some videos he's made about it. And I should probably apologize to him because I didn't watch all his videos. There was no way. There was just so much. And I was on a time schedule. I was trying to collate as much information as I could in a limited amount of time, having no idea that this was such a quagmire of trying to parse the truth out of all the misrepresentations. So I very quickly went through the transcripts of the videos on YouTube that he has made. and took notes. And he did talk about this book. So I'm going to tell you first about how this book is presented by the author in interview. And then we'll move on and we'll get to Harnish's take on the situation. So this book by Eli Frankel is called Sisters in Death. So one of the huge debates and factors in the investigation is that Elizabeth Short's murder was a one-off. They wanted really desperately to be able to find other cases, hoping that would lead them to the murderer, assuming it was a serial killer. And they've never been able to find cases. And the FBI, heard it out of their own mouths, said they've researched this thing up and down over the decades, and they've never been able to make a persuasive argument for a connection with other cases. And we mentioned the torso murders. There are other weird crimes, but when you get down to the actual technical connections, they were not there. So let me tell you how this book, Sisters in Death, is presented. Elizabeth Short was gone for 6 days before her body was found. She was in the Biltmore Hotel, and 6 days later, her body was found. And this book makes a lot of, it attests to a lot of things as though they are fact. Take this with a grain of salt. We will discuss a lot of it later, but right now, this is just what's being presented in the book. I'm not saying it's wrong or right. This is the narrative. Her body wasn't found, the story goes, because it was 12 to 14 feet from the road in 10-foot tall, not 10 foot, 10 inch, tall weeds. And it was dumped around 6:30 in the morning. They know from, somebody saw a car early in the morning, briefly. And important to know that this is in a larger residential area, but it's underdeveloped and there are numerous empty lots. And the spot where she was dumped, it's 2 big empty lots. So not a lot of eyewitnesses. It's at 6:30 in the morning and it's dark. It's January. And she wasn't discovered until 10:50, almost 11 o'clock. Now, this is questionable. The witness, Betty Bersinger, talked to a couple of different people, and apparently there's different stories that she was found face down, she was found face up, she was tossed away like trash, she was posed like a mannequin, that the cops came and they reposed her body before they took crime scene pictures. These are all the stories that are being put out there. Her father, of course, faked his own situation. Elizabeth was, as we said, disillusioned that her father wanted her to cook and clean. And she had nothing. And this was her out to get to Hollywood, to have a place to stay. No, it didn't work out. And this author does concur that she was a lost girl looking for love and security. So they had 3 weeks with no solution, and the cops needed to make it her fault. It's easier to not care about who killed somebody if the person deserved it, was the kind of the zeitgeist of the time. So they began to paint her in this way that she was at fault, as I said before, getting money for certain behaviors from unknown men. The Black Dahlia was a fallen woman, and that's not a phrase I use. I'm substituting. Her letters that she sent home talked she may have had an off and on again boyfriend, but he was married. She told people she hated Los Angeles, that the people there were very cold. So she says she's going to Florida, but then she changes her mind and she goes to Chicago to do hat modeling. Now she's got this boyfriend, and we're kind of going over her background again just a tiny bit. She has this boyfriend who's an Army pilot, and he's flying between North Carolina and Chicago. So the assumption is she rescheduled herself. She had planned to go to Florida, but she suddenly does an about face and decides to go to Chicago because she knows this boyfriend is going to be one end of his stationing, his route is Chicago. The day she disappeared, she dropped her bags at the Greyhound station because she had no place to live, but also because she was going to take the Greyhound to Chicago. So the question is, why was she at the Biltmore Hotel? It wasn't her sister she was waiting for. They found that out later. The assumption is she must have been waiting for somebody to bring her money for a ticket. Now that's an assumption. Theory. A ticket those days would have cost $85, but in our money, $530. That's a big chunk of money to come up with when you don't have a job, you're homeless, and your family is not wealthy. So over early evidence and looking at the files, they discovered today in modern times that all of these files, all the evidence had been poached. So what does that mean? Various investigators, police had take this home with me to study and never brought it back. I'll take this bit with me to the lab. It never got returned. And a lot of evidence, a lot of files were lost, and it's difficult to recreate a chronology and be really clear about everything that happened. But it was a huge case, and they got help from all over the country, including from the FBI. So to look back a little bit right before she disappeared, December 9th of 1946, she left really late at night, midnight, for a 6 or 7 hour bus trip to San Diego. It's hard for me to imagine that it took 6 or 7 hours to get from LA to San Diego, but apparently it did. And nobody knows for sure why she went down there, because she was homeless and she didn't know anyone down there that anyone else knew. Why was she escaping Los Angeles in the middle of the night? That's probably an interesting question. I wouldn't use the word escape. I'd say, why was she? Because she took the bus when the bus was available. But why was she going to San Diego? And then she returns a month later, January 9th, and she disappears 4 hours after she returns to LA. 3 days before she left for San Diego, she has a 3-day period of missing time. Nobody knows what she was up to, who she was staying with. Nobody knows. The cops could not put the timeline together. But they found a guy that she'd been with before, who down in San Diego, and he was cagey. Now the author says, well, obviously he was hiding something. Well, who knows? Was he hiding his past? Now here's where this connection is being made with another murder, that hence the sisters in death. In 1941, I keep remember the guy hiding his past. So 1941, a 24-year-old woman was murdered in Kansas City. This guy hiding his past, he was born, grew up, and lived there. And here's the statement that is debated and denied by the FBI, that she was killed very like Elizabeth. And we'll talk about why it's not very like. Her name was Lila Walsh, and she was an heiress to a big real estate empire. But her family lived in a very middle class way. Nobody knew just quite how rich they were. They lived a very unostentatious life. This guy had gone to college with her, but they knew each other before that. They'd known each other for a long time. Her family, although wealthy, lived humbly, and they agreed to send all the information they could from Kansas City to Los Angeles about her death. And the police agreed to send their information, and they never did. Well, Lila, was killed at home in her bed, in her room, asleep at 3 o'clock in the morning, with her mother and brother in the house down the hall. I won't go into details to what happened to her, but it was awful. The files, as I said, from the police never showed. So even in the 1950s, when they had 300 suspects, this guy, this alleged Kansas City killer, was at the top of the list. Now, there's no proof that he did anything other than they knew each other in the past. What the book says is there were certain things that were linking the crimes, but not enough evidence. And I think you have to be really careful. I've been a fan of true crime for a long time, and it's easy to get really excited when you think, oh, I found the truth that nobody else knows. It's really important to be impartial and studied and really demand evidence. They were both dead. That's probably the most common thing that they shared. This guy, the suspect's name was Carl Basiger, and allegedly, because we don't know, the allegation is that he was not okay, that he knew her for at least 10 years. They shared social circles. They had the same social circles as children. They went to the same church and the same church events. They both, their families went to the same lake house community in the summer, 30 miles outside of Kansas City, and they lived blocks apart. So we'll return to this story a little bit later when we talk about Larry Harnish's information. But keep him in mind, this guy in San Diego that Elizabeth Short allegedly went down to see. They're making a connection with this death in Kansas City. So allegedly for 3 days, Elizabeth was at his home. Not in San Diego, I'm sorry, in Los Angeles, that she was in his home in Los Angeles and was murdered there over the time period before she was found. What happened with Lila? Well, somebody waited in her yard for hours in 31-degree weather. There is all sorts of physical evidence of footsteps and crushed grass and plants and mucked up snow and mud. He lay in wait under a tree, and they know that he had a satchel of tools for the imprint on the ground, and it had to be heavy and it was a certain shape. He wore gloves. There were no fingerprints. He climbed in her bedroom window and then hit her. Took her 45 minutes to die while he waited patiently, staunching the mess. He mutilated her, and he used the curtains. He pulled down the curtains and he folded them like table napkins with the fancy pleats that you do when you have a fabric napkin. And then he put that on top of her so that if you came into the room, you wouldn't see blood. It's very odd. And keep in mind, there's other people in the house. Not a sound was heard. Both women did have an odd carving out of a part of their thigh. And this is the link. His father was a huge, influential executive and had a lot of influence. They traveled in the same circles, their families. He worked at a bakery, but his father, he owned a bakery, but he was on the police board and the fire commission, and he had a lot of connections. And there's the question, did politics derail the Kansas City investigation? And is that why the evidence was never sent to LA? The local Kansas City police tried to pin the whole thing on her brother and tried to make a connection between Lila's death in this tragic way and the fact that when her brother was 12, their 7-year-old sister drowned. In his 40s, he stalked an entire management company that managed the apartment building that he lived in, agents, lawyers, night after night. He was peeping and leaving weird things. This is Bersinger. And in the late 60s, he ended up fleeing California and going to the Bahamas. He got thrown out of the Bahamas for being in trouble there. And in later years, he became kind of peripatetic. He traveled all over the country, back and forth, without any roots. So let me see here. I'm going to skip. Okay, we're going to talk next here about Larry Harnish's take on this. And he talks about Hodel. That's what I was looking for if I had a separate Hodel section. And I didn't because, well, you'll see why. So Larry Harnish, he talks a bit about the monetization of true crime, that it's become a form of entertainment and the humanity is lost in the process. He says it's only for true crime fanatics that are really unconcerned with reality. They get fraudulent solutions. They jump to conclusions. They treat murder like a game of Clue. I thought that was a great quote. And I think we all who are interested in this topic, we risk falling into that category as well. It's how do we know? We only know what we're told. How do we know? We're not forensic investigators. So we have to be very cautious about making assumptions. He says people who are true crime fans make torturous leaps of logic. So about this book, he wrote a review of the book, and it was scathing. And I'm actually leaving a few things out because I don't want to get in trouble. But it's fascinating. He said that it's zealous but an amateur project that links two murders that were separated by years and distance and method. By 5 years, 1,600 miles, and they really don't have anything in common. The implication is that this was the guy who did both, and Harnish says all of law enforcement, FBI included, believed that he did neither. So I write, he's not very flattering about the true crime genre in general. He says there's no bottom to the market. It's true. Unsolved murders exert a powerful magnet on one another. In other words, in the public imagination. So it's a little bit like the psychological tendency when the human mind looks at a situation, it seeks out patterns. I forget the term for it, but it seeks out patterns. We are predisposed to make those leaps and create patterns where they perhaps don't really exist. And this is what Larry Harnish is talking about, whether he knows it or not. You know, we'll see murders and we desperately want to connect them for some reason. We abhor not knowing is why. So the book links the murders of Lila Walsh in Kansas City in March of 41 to Elizabeth Short in Los Angeles in January of 47. And he says it's an inarguable fact. So when you really get right down to it, and I trust Harnish's exceptional research skills, fact-finding skills. Balsinger, the Kansas City suspect, was stationed at McCord Field in Washington State in October of 40. And he did not have any kind of a protracted leave where he could travel from the West Coast to Kansas City. And keep in mind, travel was less easy in those days. During the war, gas was rationed. Airplane flight was not ubiquitous, and it was expensive. You saw how expensive Elizabeth Short's bus ticket would have been. Anyway, Balsinger was reassigned to Camp Pendleton in June of 41. He was beholden to the military and was on base, living on base, and had to go to work every day in the military, and records show that he was not in Kansas City. The Walsh murder was a blitz attack on a sleeping victim found where she was killed. Her body wasn't moved. It was a bloody, disorganized mess. The weapons were left nearby. It's not at all like the Elizabeth Short case. Now, the argument could be made that serial killers evolve and change their MO, and that's very true. But this is a big change. She was murdered elsewhere. She was exsanguinated like 100% intentionally. Bisected with surgical skill. When they looked at her, the coroner, they were like, this is not something that an ordinary person would even know how to do. You'd have to have a real working knowledge of anatomy. She was washed and scrubbed and left in open view. In December of 46, Balsinger did know Elizabeth. He knew her for a few days before she left from Hollywood to go to San Diego for that month. And she was with him for 3 days, and they found out what they were up to. On day one, she drove with him in his car to Camarillo with his business partner, with 3 people in the car. They went to Camarillo because Balsinger was starting a business down there. On day 2, all 3 of them returned to Los Angeles, and he gave her money for a room. On day 3, he took her to the bus station in Hollywood to go to San Diego and put her stuff, in wherever, and he never saw her again. His name is in her address book, but we'll talk about that. So although they did intersect some time that was spent at Camp Cook from June to August, a couple of months in 43, he was the company commander training with the 6th Army, and she worked at the PX on base, and she lived in a civilian dormitory on base. But the Harnish says, you take a second and realize that the population on this base was larger than today's population of Beverly Hills. There were more than 36,000 people living on that base, and it's a big assumption to say that everybody knew everybody else. One fact that was never confirmed was that she had been living with this sergeant whom she reported. The reason she broke up with him, because remember, he mistreated her. She reported that, and he got sent overseas by the military, and that what happened to her was a revenge motive. This is a false narrative. The investigators were never able to find any Sergeant Chuck or anybody associated with her ever that got sent overseas. Balsinger was a baker, which we know now, but he wasn't. It's alleged in the book that it was a butcher who did this. Well, he was a baker. The book claims that he had butchering skills. Whoever hurt her, whoever killed her. The lead detective said no ordinary butcher could have done this. This was precision, skilled surgery. Gross. Harnish is angry at the claim that the police moved her body and posed it before they took crime scene photos. He said there's no basis in fact, as evidenced by the crime scene photos, that she was ever moved. She was just left there. He says the book doesn't really talk about the hotels, and he says there are staggering mistakes on almost every page. So the hotels, I don't know why I keep calling them hotel. The hotels are a very odd family. Steve Hodel is a retired Los Angeles homicide detective. His half-sister, stepsister, Fawn, wrote a book. It's unbelievable. Incredible book. I don't mean that in a good way. And Steve Hodel wrote he's written a number of books. He became a private investigator after he left the police force in Los Angeles. His father, George, was a doctor, and Harnish describes him as unconventional. I would actually say it was more extreme than that. He was weirder than you know what. Very, very weird person. I think he had his issues. Let's just put it that way. As a child, George moved a lot as a child. He was overseas and back with his family. He was married a number of times. He had numerous children, and he eventually died in San Francisco. Now, if you want to know more about him, I would recommend finding Steve Hodel's books about it. I intentionally decided to not go into it because it's a huge rabbit hole, incredible stories surrounding this man. Steve was clearing out his father's stuff after he died, and he found a couple of photos of a woman. It was actually two different women, and he decided that they were both Elizabeth Short, and they're not. So Steve decides immediately that his father killed her and also was a prolific serial killer of many unsolved cases, and you got to read his books. I think it is a reflection of the trauma of a very unusual childhood. He claims his father was a prime suspect in the Black Dahlia, and no, he never was a prime suspect. The Los Angeles police tagged him as a suspect at first, put him under surveillance for 5.5 weeks, bugged his house, and completely satisfied themselves that they could eliminate him as a suspect. Now, he had a shady past. The rumor is that he did all that work for rich people as a doctor in Los Angeles. He made it very easy for wealthy men to do what they do. There were 3 prime suspects, and we're going to look at them briefly. Red Manley, the guy who gave her the drive from San Diego to Los Angeles, took her to drop off her stuff. He was one. Joseph Dumais was an Army corporal at Fort Dix. He confessed, and it looked like he might possibly be the one, and then it just all fell apart. And then a guy called Leslie Dillon. Larry calls this whole suspect situation with Leslie Dillon a debacle. So Hodel claimed that his father killed his own secretary so that she couldn't rat on him for his other crimes. Her name was Ruth Balding, and Larry says he looked into this intensely. She was not murdered. It was self-harm. She OD'd on barbiturates, and she was actually never assumed to have been murdered by the police department. This is a story that was made. Larry says that the two photos that Hodel found his father had were actually of two totally different women. So we're talking three women: woman number one in the picture, woman number two in the other picture, and Elizabeth, and never the twain or three shall meet. One came forward and said, well, that's me, and I'm not Elizabeth Short, and I'm not that other woman either. Her family, Elizabeth's family, looked at the pictures and said, that's not her. Steve Hodel claimed that AI says that it is, but AI also, I think they denied 90% of the insurance covered people, denied them medical care when they filed claims, 90%. So, okay, so Hodel barely graduated from medical school, and he only had the bare minimum of surgical training that comes with the basic medical school background. He was smart. He went to medical school very young, but he was no brilliant, experienced surgeon. What he was, his specialty was venereal disease, as they called it in those days. He had a postdoc in sexually transmitted infections. He was never accredited by the American College of Surgeons. He was not a surgeon. Leslie Dillon was a prime suspect. And why was this a debacle? Well, there was a rogue investigation within the Los Angeles Police Department, not done by the homicide department. They knew nothing about it. These rogue cops decided this guy was probably guilty. They lured him to Las Vegas. They drove him around. They didn't tell, roughing him up. They didn't tell the homicide division what they were doing. This all was exposed. It went to the LA County grand jury. They began investigating, and they just said, oh, this is ridiculous. I think they did call it a debacle. Other accusations about George Hodel were made based on things he said when his house was bugged. But the thing is, he knew his house was bugged, and he intentionally said things to get a rise out of the police. Outrageous things. Ultimately, he was clear. They had factual record of where he was, who he was with, what he was doing, and he was cleared. But the police are still looking. They're looking for somebody with medical training. They looked at anyone who had any kind of medical training who'd been accused of a sex crime. And one of the accused was a guy called Patrick O'Reilly, who was an orthopedics surgeon, and he was associated with two friends of Elizabeth. So, and I couldn't find any other information about him. I'm sure there are books out there, but I simply didn't have time. Just know that there were other suspects. So, talking with the behavioral analysts, this is the conclusion that they came to, that how and where she was dumped actually tells us a lot about the crime. It was meant to traumatize others. How would you like to run into that on your way to work? It was found by a young mom pushing her child in a stroller. I mean, first thing in the morning. God. It was meant to shock the community and wanted to put the fear of God in the neighborhood. This was a white, middle-class neighborhood, everything's all dandy. The FBI thought that the killer may have had an informal relationship with this specific neighborhood. The kind of neighborhood had meaning for him. But what was done with anger. So they asked questions like, why was he angry, and why did he dump them here? is it what it represented, the neighborhood, or is it this specific neighborhood? In either case, was he screwed out of property, or like this neighborhood, or in this neighborhood? Is it the neighborhood of somebody with whom he's got a grievance? Did he live close by? So there's some sort of connection there. If not in real life, an emotional or psychological connection. And then they talk about Elizabeth, that she was the first person to fictionalize her life before anyone ever did. She was not an aspiring actress. She may have told people she was going for auditions, but she didn't. What was she really like? To talk to her, they said, would be like talking to a homeless woman who looks very pulled together and is, pulling a rolling suitcase, couch surfing. And if you sat down and spoke with her superficially, it would be light and fine and everything's good and she'd seem fine. The longer you talk to her, the odder and odder the whole thing would get. That she had a cover story that hid numerous demons. She was bouncing from place to place. She didn't really work. She couldn't really hold a job down. She would talk about applying for jobs, but she never did. She sponged off roommates. Her mother sent her money. She worked guys who'd send her money. Now, I'm not making, and Larry Harnish is not making aspersions against her ethical or moral behavior. This was a person who had issues and needed money to survive. And she wasn't above going on a date, having dinner, so there's a meal, and then asking for money, to borrow money. And many guys, they had nothing to do with her after that first request. They gave her money, and that was the last time that they went out with her because she wasn't reciprocating, if you catch my drift. She worked guys who sent her money. She had a litany of sob stories about why she needed to borrow money. She talked about she needed medicine. She talked about she had a modeling job, but they needed pictures immediately and she couldn't afford it. She had a check to cash and she was having trouble cashing the check and she needed cash for the rent. She did hundreds of first dates. She'd ask guys for money all the time. When the guy expected a favor in return and she didn't deliver, he'd be gone and she'd be on to the next one. She was a very disorganized, disordered personality. And her address book is a real reflection of that. They thought, oh, we have her address book. This is going to be fabulous. It wasn't organized alphabetically. It wasn't organized chronologically. It was a haphazard mess and they could not make sense of it. Her fiance being killed was probably a pivotal moment. She already had insecurity in her life. She had the trauma of losing her father, the insecurity of their economic situation growing up. Kind of feeling aimless. Sounds a little bit like depression too. I'm not diagnosing, I'm just remarking. And she sees this opportunity. Oh, my father, he's alive. He loves me. He wants me to come. She goes out there and that falls apart. Then the fiance dies. I mean, this is trauma after trauma. She came from this hard background. Her father, she saw as a ticket out, and he had betrayed her once already, and then it was another betrayal. She invented herself. She told people she was from a fine old Boston family. She was just appalled by Los Angeles. This was her story. She relied on others for survival. She was scrambling for survival. She was a survivor. She lied. She said she'd worked with the USO, kind of, donut dolly, during the war. She never did. But they agree, the experts agree on these facts. It was not a serial killing. This is a rookie opinion. She was a high-risk victim. It was a lust murder. Now this is actually coming from what's his name? John Douglas, the famous guy who helped to invent behavioral analysis. Not a serial killing, high risk victim. It was a lust murder. It wasn't random. They probably knew each other for a while, even if it was a short period of time. This wasn't a one night stand or a stranger killing. They knew each other. There was a very risky drop-off site. It was a choice. You have a car and a body to get rid of. Why would you do it in such an open place? And he described the field where she was dropped, the empty lot where she was dropped. In every direction, it's flat and there's an unobstructed view. Very odd choice of places. There's some question, did she cross paths with somebody who was like a customer for a few days, or a repeat customer who had a problem? And she was at this point so desperate, she was plugging her cavities and her teeth with wax because she had no money for the dentist. They don't believe it was a youthful offender. They believe it was somebody desensitized to blood, who was skilled with a bladed object, who thought with his hands and not with his head. I thought that was interesting. One interesting thing that I don't believe anyone has really investigated, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought this was interesting. Irish mentioned this. He looked at this street, I think it's called Norton Avenue, where she was dumped in this lot. And he was, for a very long time, why was she dumped there? Why the choice of that place? What was that all about? And then one day somebody called him up and said, hey, I have a huge box of stuff about Elizabeth Short. Do you want it? I know you're doing good work. He gets it and he goes through it, and amongst many, many other pages of stuff, he finds her sister Virginia, who lives in Los Angeles. He finds her sister Virginia's marriage license. And so he looks at this marriage license and he sees who the matron of honor was. The matron of honor grew up and her family lived approximately 1 block from the dump site. And the matron of honor's father was a surgeon. His name was Walter Bailey. So, food for thought. But she was dumped like trash. There's an element of anger and disrespect there. John Douglas, the expert, said the slash to him said she said something that upset the guy. He wanted to shut her up, or he wanted to punish her for something she said. He thinks ultimately she rejected a seduction. Douglas believed they spent time together, and he said this was an attack on her. This was not an attack on a random woman. This was specifically personal on her. So that's my research on a very sad story of Elizabeth Short, who I think ultimately the experts seem to believe was a troubled young woman who was rootless and desperate and a survivor, and she fell afoul of the wrong person. So thank you very much for watching, and be sure to watch our next video, part 2, where Denise and I do a closer look, a deeper dive into this case. I appreciate it very much that you're watching, and Slán go fóill, Sláinte.